talk about. Is Xi Jinping for turning? Then, can we have another trade war, this time between the European Union and the United States over green technology? And finally, tanks? Yes, tanks. Finally, the Germans, after prodding by the United States and an agreement by the United States to send its own tanks, have decided that it's time to arm Ukraine with offensive tank capabilities to retake the territory that Ukraine has lost from the Russians. Here to talk about all of these issues this week are Jamil Anderlini, who is the editor-in-chief, Politico Europe. Jamil, great to see you again.
Great to see you, Ivo.
Peter Spiegel, U.S. managing editor of the Financial Times. Peter, great to see you.
Thanks for having me on again, Ivo.
And God, we're going to stick with this, right? And Elise Labott, founder of Zivi Media and formerly of CNN. Elise, great to see you again.
Good to be with you.
Jamil, let's start with you. And China, it appears, and Davos seemed to underscore that a autocracy like Xi Jinping, which normally is seen as a country that is pretty set in its ways, is ready to turn. And the end of zero COVID, opening up of economic messaging to say, come on in, we love you, and a general sense that they are looking to restart the Chinese economy by opening up to the West. Is that the way we should be looking at recent events, or is this a tactical adjustment as part of a much more strategic effort to maintain control within China, both of the economy and, importantly, of the narrative of Xi Jinping?
Look, it's clear that Beijing is now on a charm offensive. The problem is there's no real change in policy apart from the getting rid of the zero COVID, and they're just not that charming. The problem is that you've got diplomats going around who are toning down the former kind of crazy wolf warrior, the West is evil and we're going to dominate, the West is declining, the East is rising, all this stuff. That's all been toned down. But the facts on the ground, apart from the end of zero COVID, haven't really changed. And if you look at zero COVID and the ending of that policy, it's a complete disaster. They kind of had no choice because it was getting out of control anyway. But in the time that that Xi Jinping's government dithered, they didn't vaccinate all the population. They didn't prepare the health system for this mass wave. We have no idea how many people have actually died, although I have family in China, and anecdotally in the biggest cities, in the biggest and richest cities with the best healthcare systems, they were cutting off people they would even treat at the age of 65. Anyone older than 65 was getting sent home to die because they just didn't have the capacity. I mean, that's horrible for any doctor, any health system to have to do, and that's what they had to do. The official numbers, I'm sure, are massively underreported. 66,000 people having died in the last month or two. I'm sure that's a massive undercounting. And COVID, we've just gone through, all the migrant workers in the big cities have gone back home to the villages in the last couple of weeks for Chinese New Year, and they have spread COVID across the entire country into the villages where there is no healthcare to speak of. And I can just imagine that, millions of people probably have died or are going to die in this period. We'll never know probably the real numbers because the Communist Party is going to cover that up. And it's just a complete disaster. And it I think, just shoots a massive hole in this idea of competence in the Communist Party, the Communist Party's apparent record of competence and Xi Jinping's control. I think he also freaked out because it was the first time since 1989 you had protests across the whole country on basically the same issue. And so I think it's just a massive case of misgovernance. And I think they're trying to sort of turn the page and say it's all fine now, what COVID, but deeply damaging to Xi Jinping domestically, politically.
Jamil, I mean, I know this is almost impossible to know, but just to follow up on that exact point, there was a lot of, when the protest started several months ago, there was a lot of discussion about it was the largest protest since Tiananmen. Is this the next Tiananmen? He then, reverses course and opens up. But there is the point you made about the huge damage to the credibility. There still is a lot of speculation that going forward, Xi's ability to exert the kind of authoritarian control over the countryside that he has seen in his second term may be damaged. And this actually may be even in some ways fatal to his leadership. Is that overstating the case? I mean, can you do a little bit of forward looking about what this would mean potentially for his rule going forward?
Yeah, thank you, Peter, taking Ivo's job. But thank you. Look,
I'll start to comment too, right?
Yeah, you should,
Ivo, why don't you comment too, please? Thank you.
I don't think it's. I don't think it would be wise of me to predict that it would be fatal to Xi Jinping's rule in the short term. I think it's deeply, deeply damaging. Equally, or maybe equally damaging, I would say, was what he did in the 20th Party Congress in October, which is effectively neutralize all factions and promote tier 2 city mayors to be the standing committee of the Politburo. It's a sort of Stalin move, what he did. He took like complete loyalists who are, deeply mediocre, complete loyalists, almost all of them, and elevate them to the very, very top of the Communist Party. That is extremely damaging for his credibility and I think his future grip on the country. Combine that with his missteps in foreign policy, which are legion and very serious, plus his mismanagement of the economy, and then this just very blatant sort of just terrible example of misgovernance when it comes to COVID. I think all of these things are hurting his credibility. And you just have to look at the messaging of how in control and how brilliant and the dear leader is so genius and amazing to show just how worried he is about how bad his credibility has been damaged. I think those are always, in my mind, in inverse proportion.
Yeah, no, that's certainly true. And you then worry also about foreign adventurism in order to stoke nationalist sentiment. And Elise, I wonder, we've also seen it. It sends to me, at least in the White House and in the executive branch, less so in Congress, a kind of a change in tone, particularly since Biden met with Xi in Bali late last year. An attempt to sort of open up. Tony Blinken is going to go early next week, I believe, or no, the week after that, to China. Yellen met with Liu He in outside of Davos, and there's this sort of sense that maybe we've gone a little too far, and in terms of our strong opposition. Maybe we need to engage the Chinese more, if only to demonstrate to the rest of the world that if there is a problem, it's their cause. They are the cause, not us. Is that what you're seeing happening?
Well, I think you definitely see this kind of Chinese move. I think was more kind of a preemptive move by China, knowing that it has these economic problems, knowing that it needs to improve the diplomatic atmosphere. This softening of what we saw over the last few years, this so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, this very belligerent, China is the next dominant world power and get used to it. And, we're going to be dictating the terms. And then the saber rattling vis-a-vis Taiwan. I think there's an effort by China to lower the temperature. And I think the US is picking up on that. And so are the Europeans, and certainly the Australians are enjoying, somewhat better relations now with China, because I think China knows that in order to launch the kind of economic reforms and really improve things, that it needs to improve its relations with the United States. So there's a new, softer message from China. And you saw in Davos last week, the Vice Premier Liu He, offered this olive branch saying China's this kinder, gentler Beijing. We're open for business now. And this national reality dictating that opening up to the world is a must, not an expediency. He said, we need to open up wider and make it work better. And so there's this charm offensive. I think the US doesn't really know if it's genuine or if it's just, a little bit more of a kinder, gentler face. But at the same time, I think the United States also, if we need to improve the world economic climate, it can't just be improving relations with China to show that we're the good guys. It needs to be genuine, and the cooperation needs to be genuine. And so I think that, it can't be Biden having better relations with Xi Jinping just to show that the U.S. is a kinder, gentler face to China. I think it needs to be genuine cooperation on both sides.
Ivo, the other point I would just make, just the flip side of your concern about given domestic problems within China, does Xi then lash out and try to do something externally to rally the nation? The flip side of that also will be interesting to see what happens with the Russian alliance, because if he has problems at home, does he want more problems abroad by drawing closer to Putin? Or is this charm offensive? And perhaps the way that the Biden administration views it is, we have an opening now.
I just have to push back at you on this whole, and we've had this discussion before, on this whole idea that, China is offering this huge support to Vladimir Putin. It's rhetorical at best. If you look at what Russia, needs from China, what do they need? They need, weapons. They need spare parts. They need to unfreeze their currency. This no limits partnership seems to have a lot of limits. So I think the only thing the U.S. could really expect China to do is just abandon Putin, even rhetorically, and join the international alliance against Russia. And you're not going to see that. So I think, this you're with us or against us approach on China, I actually think that China has been, maybe I'm naive, but has been remarkably muted. Chinese are not happy about what's going on in Russia. And I certainly don't see, at least beyond, handshakes and statements, a full-throated support for Putin or for the war in Ukraine. What thoughts?
Well, last time we fought was over Saudi Arabia. I don't think it was over China, but
I think there's more support. I think, look, I think you're both right. How's that?
Hey, I like that.
But I think there's, I think I completely agree with you that Xi Jinping was caught off guard and is extremely upset by Putin's adventurism in Ukraine. They're like, you got us to say no limits partnership, and then you invaded Ukraine. Screw you. Thank you very much, buddy. And so there's like a real anger about that, and they were not happy. At the same time, they're never going to abandon Russia,
exactly.
And so I agree with you on that. But I think you're underplaying a little bit the support that they're providing. I think that there is, they are supporting economically Russia, helping Russia to evade sanctions in very, very many ways. There's a lot of business going on. There's a lot of energy trade going on and other trade going on, and I think actually that there is support for some of the weapons programs. They're not sending Chinese tanks, right? And they're not sending Chinese drones. Those are Iranian drones, but they are helping with some of the stuff with enough plausible deniability that you can say, well, I don't see Chinese weapons on the battlefield, but the chips and things like that, they're definitely supplying those. The things that, the Russians are famously stripping washing machines to put in their guided missiles. The Chinese are helping on that front for sure. And so I just think, I think that the rest of the world could expect more restraint from China when it comes to support from Russia. And that I feel that Xi Jinping boxed himself into a bit of a corner, because certainly in Europe, the Europeans would have told America to butt out and let us deal with, trade with China as much as we want if China had renounced its support for Russia right at the start. That was the thing the Europeans were waiting for. They would have wholeheartedly embraced China, I think. And they can't, because China has shown far too much support for Russia. And so they're very reluctantly lining up behind America when it comes to sanctions on chips and high-tech stuff to China, the Dutch and others. They're very reluctantly, siding with America. And many, many people in Europe want to just tell America to butt out and want to be friends with
Jamil and Peter and Elise. Just a final question, and actually it sort of almost starts feeding into our next segment. one way to read it, and Jamil, you're closest to it, but Peter and at least you can see it too, is what is this charm offensive is actually directed not at Washington but at Brussels. That it's really designed to give, the Germans in particular, but others are deeply intertwined economically with China. They don't talk about, they say no decoupling. It's a multipolar world. We need de-risking, is the new phrase, which is reducing the impact of dependence on China in a way that we have done with Russia on energy. But this is a critical market. We need to play. We need to be involved. And now the message you're hearing from China is we've opened up the country so you can go without quarantining and all of that. You'll get COVID, but at least you'll be able to come in. We're open for business. By the way, delivered by the guy who's today the vice premier and tomorrow is retired because he's not long going to be around. The World War diplomacy is gone, which was particularly heavy in Europe. The ambassador of France and others were really in there. And so if I'm sitting in the Elysee or I'm sitting in the chancellery in Germany, I'm thinking, hey, we're back in business.
Or
down street. And is that sort of does that make sense? That's
I think you're
what they're really trying to do.
You've absolutely nailed it, and that's why the message delivered at Davos, because it's a European thing. There's all these Europeans, and they were desperate to hear this. Like, and Liu He gave multiple background briefings to people some of us are all friends with, and others. And what it was all about was saying, the world should be multipolar, and Europe should have an independent. They're trying to play to the sort of the vanity of the Europeans, independent foreign policy. Don't be vassal states of America. That was what it was all about, and the Europeans lap it up because what they worry about here in Europe is being forced by America to basically shut themselves out of the giant Chinese market. Not as giant as they believe it to be, but still quite a big market. And then what they worry about is like a Trump or someone like him coming back, and then America going in and making a deal with China, and like Europe's left on the sidelines and totally cut out and like treated as traitorous. We've talked about this a bit before, Ivo, on the show. Every meeting I have with every Coreper and Perm Rep and all these weird names for diplomats that they have here, anytime I meet with one of these people, what they say is all the Americans want to do is talk about China, and that all they want to do is force us to distance ourselves from China and be mean to China. And we don't want to do it. We want to sell stuff to China. Like, tell America to stop being mean to us and stop making us be mean to China. And so this charm offensive, I completely agree with you, is almost 100, I think, mostly directed towards the Europeans and splitting them from the Americans. But I don't think it'll work, by the way, because they're just, as I said, not that charming. They have a new ambassador here in Brussels, and he went in to do his charm offensive thing in the commission. And I happened to go in to see very senior people at the commission right afterwards. And they were like, oh my God, these guys just cannot, they're just such losers and they're so rude. And like, anyway, it's very interesting. I just think it won't work. So.
Just to say, it has always been thus. I mean, I remember being in Brussels when there was a dispute between the Japanese and the Chinese on the Shinkaku Islands. Biden, as vice president at the time, flies to Tokyo to show unity with the Japanese, and back-to-back, Angela Merkel, David Cameron both go to Beijing to sell stuff. I mean, the approach to China by the Europeans is always incredibly mercantilist. They don't have the internal market that we have, that American companies can sell internally. So they have to sell to China. And I think the Brits and Rishi Sunak has said they have changed their policy towards China, but I haven't seen any evidence on that. But I think the Europeans have always viewed China as a very mercantilist policy as opposed to a geopolitical challenge.
Yeah, and that's frankly, I think is one of the issues that needs to change, right? And that the U.S. is trying to change in the conversation, and part of that, and maybe it's a great segue to our second topic, because the disagreement, which is now real and it's playing out in the nation's finest newspapers and magazines with an op-ed in The Economist from the U.S. side, with a counter response by the EU side in the Financial Times over these green subsidies and the IRA, which I always thought stood for the Irish Republican Army, but apparently stands for something else. The Inflation Reduction Act, which
I thought that too. I was like,
individual retirement accounts. I thought we were talking about retirement accounts now. Individual retirement.
Well, whatever it is. But so that's why we're going to talk about green subsidies, because that seems to be the real issue. But Peter, it's been festering since the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. It took a while for Europe to actually notice, and there's been a debate in Europe about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, in the sense that spending on subsidizing for climate is a good thing, and particularly the United States doing that. But it is becoming the top, not only the topic du jour, it's the topic du semaine. It's the only thing people want to talk about. It was the topic in Davos, and you add to that sort of the China issue. Are we seeing the breakup? Are we seeing a real fundamental conflict here, or is there a way out? And sort of give us the background on where we are and where this is going.
I think there is a way out, but just to back up, I don't think it just caught the Europeans by surprise. Frankly, I think it caught both sides by surprise. I don't think even the White House realized the giant sucking sound of green investment that would flow out of Europe into the U.S. Because of this. I mean, just as backup, there's about $370 billion worth of green subsidies in the IRA. About more than half of that is in tax credits for companies that invest in green in the U.S. So what has suddenly almost overnight has happened, and we've seen this not only the Europeans started complaining about it. The Belgian prime minister saying all these Americans are showing up and telling all our Belgian companies to move to the U.S. But you've seen it on the U.S. side. Bankers, particularly in the energy sector, who used to be working on M&A deals in West Texas, are now organizing deals for European companies to invest in greenfield production in West Virginia and whatnot. You've seen it with Jobs Ohio and these economic development agencies for various states picking up and showing in Europe and going to Germany and Brussels and Belgium to attract European companies. I mean, it really has created an immense incentive for everyone to invest in the U.S. And what the Europeans are angry at, I mean, frankly, the European companies aren't quite upset by this, because many of them are going to get benefits. What the European companies are upset about is that the investment that Europe has seen itself as the leader in green technologies, that they laid the groundwork for green development, and all that investment now is going to shift to the U.S. So European investors are moving to the U.S., not necessarily the European companies. You've heard some of the car companies, it's not just actually the Europeans. We've heard the Koreans and some Japanese are also angry about this, because obviously the Koreans in particular with Hyundai have invested very heavily in electric vehicles, and they have built plants here. I think the way out is going to be some sort of compromise on what it means to have U.S. only parts to particularly electric vehicles and to batteries. The problem is, if you remember, this even goes back to your time in Brussels, there was a time during the Obama administration that we thought there was going to be what was called TTIP. There was going to be a transatlantic trade deal between the EU and the US. If that deal had ever been passed, then things that were European, that were being exported from Europe into the US to, plants in South Carolina for BMW, or plants for Mercedes is in Alabama, I think, that were shipped from Europe into EV plants in the US would have counted as part of under the IRA. But because there is no trade deal with the EU, they are not covered. So if you're a BMW plant in South Carolina, you have to buy American in order to qualify for these subsidies. So it's caused a huge amount of rupture. The other thing that's been happening on the Brussels end is like, oh gosh, now we have to do it. Do we have to have our own IRA? And that's caused internal frictions, because basically the French in particular have said, yes. I mean, the French have always been the champions of state-led subsidies. They like, we got to have Americans are doing our ripping a page from the French playbook. They're doing industrial policy. We have to do that. And then you get the Dutch and the Finns and the Danes and the sort of traditional northern capitalist club who's saying, no, that's not what we're all about here. And interestingly, the EU state aid rules are in many ways stricter than the Americans are in terms of the ability to do state subsidies. So the Europeans are sort of hand-tied here. They cannot counter what the Americans have done. I do think there is going to be a compromise here. I think Macron was in Washington a few months ago They talked about it. They've set up working groups where they're talking about the ability to sort of fudge this over. It's going to come down to a technical definition of what a trade deal is. There's going to be some sort of deal that the IRA covers that allows trade deal countries to get the subsidies. And it's just going to be what the definition of that is. But look, this is what we hire lawyers for, particularly trade lawyers, and I think they'll figure it out. It's just getting very bad because by the time they work it out, we could have seen all the investment already arriving here in the U.S. and first mover advantage on this. You know, they're not going to suddenly pick up sticks and leave Ohio because the EU now has its own version of the IRA. So it's a tough one for the Europeans in particular.
So I met with the chief technology officer for Volvo, the Swedish trucking company, last week in Davos, and he said that the IRA is extremely powerful. In fact, it is the most powerful environmental package I've ever seen. And he's like basically saying this is humiliating for the Europeans who see themselves as the leaders on this stuff. And America in one thing is just like blown that whole thing out of the way. And what he said was that their first tier suppliers in the green transformation, so battery companies in particular, he said they're absolutely reprioritizing where they establish their presence and where they invest. And he said they are massively upgrading their North American footprint and massively downgrading their EU footprint, just purely based on that piece of legislation. I thought that was really, really interesting and real evidence that this is having immediate
Jamil
effect.
points out an interesting dynamic here, which I've noticed with the Brits in particular, which is the governments are angry. Right. I mean, the British government, even now that's outside the EU, is thinking about giving even harder line with the Americans than the EU has. But the British companies are like, no, don't. We like this. We're going to get all these tax breaks in America. So it's interesting how a company like Volvo will actually maybe be diverging from its EU member government on the benefits of this, as they'd like to go to America and take advantage of this.
What they want is more benefits in Europe as well.
I think we should, but I do think we should kind of branch this out a little. You have the discussion over the green subsidies, and you also have this whole thing about how the U.S. is trying to, put, tighter export restrictions on semiconductors and semiconductor making equipment to China. And something akin to, although I'm not an economist and I'm going to probably botch the way they're doing it, but it's something akin to financial sanctions that if foreign companies and foreign countries are, working with China to produce these semiconductors and if they want to negatively affect China's ability to do that. And so they're essentially putting another export control, and then we go back to the whole Trump administration and what they were doing with China and Europe on the automobiles and things like that. And so I think the tariff, it's akin to like a tariff. So I think that Europe is feeling right now like, hey, you want us to compete with you against China. You want to thwart China in terms of a global competitor. We should be doing this together. You shouldn't be punishing us for working with China. You're asking us to make you the leader in semiconductor technology. Like, what are we getting for it? Basically, they feel like the U.S. has their foot on Europe's neck, and I think it's just between the semiconductors and the green subsidies, it's just creating a really bad taste in Europe's mouth right now. And we're going to talk about tanks in a minute, about the larger U.S.-Europe, relationship. But when it comes to China, I think the Europe doesn't necessarily have a problem working with China. They'd rather work with the United States together. But if the U.S. is going to play hardball,
it's an export control regime. I mean, it is exactly what you're saying. The Dutch, in particular, have a very, very high end chip company that's sold into China. The Japanese also. Sometimes you forget our Asian friends over here. But now the FT is owned by a Japanese company. I have to signal the Japanese are furious about this too. There's Tokyo Electron, which is a semiconductor company.
It's not an incentive. It's a stick. It's an export control. You're not allowed to sell into China. Now, Tokyo Electron is not a company that we follow, but 30% of their business is selling into China. And the Americans say, if you do that, you are barred from the American market. So there are very close allies who are very, very angry about this. It's interesting, though. Again, Elise, you're very right to have us take a step back. What is slightly interesting to me about this is we in America suddenly have embraced
industrial policy, right? We're picking winners. We are creating trade regimes that, frankly, used to be the domain of the Europeans, and now the Europeans are angry that we're starting to do it. And it's just a very interesting, shoe on the other foot kind of dynamic here.
The last vestige of the Washington Consensus is right here in Brussels.
It's true. It's true.
No.
Invented by the Brits, who are now gone.
I sort of want to point to we focused on one of the unintended consequences of this legislation. And I do think, as far as the White House is concerned, maybe not the Department of Commerce, certainly not USTR, and definitely not Joe Manchin. But one of the unintended consequences of the legislation was that it was going to hurt our European and Asian allies, which really wasn't what they were trying to do. They were trying to actually think through how do you
create... but again, but there's no strategic vision here in terms of how this
is an unintended consequence of a negotiation.
It's always an unintended consequence.
This was a negotiation between Joe Manchin and Chuck Schumer in order to get a deal through that no one thought was coming through. And when it did come through, everybody said amen, and they didn't have time to read it. There's a second unintended consequence, which is even more, in some ways, in the U.S. way, notable. Where is all this investment going in the United States? It's going to non-union states,
red states,
and states and states that rely on very dirty energy. So you building battery factories in West Virginia and Kentucky, which are the only states that still rely on coal in order to produce the energy for the factories that are supposed to be green. And the green states, blue states, and I live in one in Illinois, gets shut out of this, even though that ought to be the spiel. So there's so many, when you deal with the legislation of $600 billion, you're going to get a lot of discontinuities and externalities, as the economists say, that you're going to deal with. And Elise, you're right. It would be great to have a strategic perspective, but you've known Washington long enough. It's just not how legislation comes together.
All I'm saying is one man's unintended consequence is another man's unforced error. And you've seen time and time again where the administration, whether it's working with Congress or whatever, the United States as a government as a whole takes these policies in a vacuum without thinking about how it's going to affect, whether it's European allies, whether it was the thing with AUKUS, things that are like unforced errors that if they had thought about the bigger picture, maybe what could have been avoided.
Yeah, I think the only exception to that, so they tried to do it on semiconductors and failed. They spent a lot of time with the Japanese and the Dutch prior to the October 7th executive order. The other one, and that's a great segue, is when it comes on confronting Russia and supporting Ukraine, where it seems that there is this tendency to think in national terms, but then the larger picture appears all of a sudden. And so, Elise, we have a deal on tanks that, let's be real, 3 months ago, no one ever thought would even come. We wouldn't be in the position we are. But we're sending now about 120 tanks are going to be sent, Western tanks. Remember, a lot of Soviet-era tanks have been sent to Ukraine from our East European allies, but Western tanks are going to be sent to Ukraine over the next few months. And it was, in the end, alliance unity this need to be together that unlocked the deal. But bring us up to date about where this come from, and what does this really tell us about sort of where the policy of the U.S. and the Europeans with regard to Ukraine and Russia is going?
Well, President Biden announced on Wednesday he would send 31, a battalion of M1 Abrams tanks to Ukraine. And this comes after these, large, back channel negotiations with Germany in particular, but largely other European leaders. They're ready to send tanks, whether it's the German-made Leopards and other countries that use that, whether it's the UK and its brand of tanks, the Challenger.
The
Challenger. They were only going to do it if the U.S. put some skin in the game, and they said, if you do it, we'll do it. And the U.S., the Pentagon basically said, not a good idea. not feasible, not practical. They're too difficult to use in that theater. We don't want to do it. And then these, Germany's like, okay, well, we're not going to do it. We need to move in concert with one another. And so even though military leaders didn't think it was a very good idea, at the end of the day, Biden understood that he wanted to keep, what was, largely European unity, transatlantic unity, NATO unity on supporting Ukraine. And, obviously this comes in advance of Ukraine wanting to, make a new offensive to take back territory seized by Russia. We're counting on a new Russian offensive. It's inching the U.S. and its NATO allies closer to, direct conflict with Russia, because now Russia's, out, they've kind of hinted at this before, but this is like the most concrete example of them pointing to a proxy war. And, obviously the U.S. is like, this is not, and the West is like, this is not a proxy war. If you leave, there's no war. But certainly it definitely puts the Europe and NATO in more closer. And I think what's so amazing is how far we've come at each, at each point in the war. At first, there was no way the U.S. was going to send javelins. There was no way the U.S. was going to send Patriot batteries. And more as this war lags on, as the Ukrainians show, more and more fortitude against the Russians, obviously not decisive, but certainly giving them more and more. And, we have to look ahead to now, President Zelensky is amazing. He's like, that's really great. And I can't wait to have that talk about fighter jets and F-16s, which, would seem unthinkable now. In a few weeks, we'll see where we are. But as you said in introducing the segment, I think what's so, I think what needs, to be taken into consideration in all this is President Biden came into office, pledging to strengthen alliances. On Ukraine, he's done largely well. But when you look at issues as is China in particular, but, on climate, on other issues, there's a mixed bag. And so this was really an effort by the president to really solidify this alliance on Ukraine.
Hey, Elise, can I ask you a specific question about Germany on this? Because very quickly, though, on the Pentagon point, I like how the Pentagon's argument was, the Abrams, they're crap. You don't want them. You want the Leopards and the Challengers. I'm not sure why the Pentagon thought that was a good argument, that our tanks are worse than your tanks. But anyway, on the Germans, because I think we slightly mischaracterized this as a transatlantic spat, because it really wasn't a transatlantic spat. It was basically the Americans plus almost everyone else against the Germans, right? The Danes wanted to do it. The Poles wanted to do it. Everyone else wanted to send tanks. And Scholz has been, I think we've all sort of, when Merkel left, we were sort of saying, does a German chancellor all of a sudden become a leader of Europe because he's the German chancellor? Or do you need someone with a leadership style and credibility of a Merkel? And thus far, I got to say, Scholz has been somewhat disappointing. He just almost every policy.
Yeah, that's fair. That's certainly fair. And you're closer to it. And Jamil's closer to it than I am. But I think he's brand new. And I think he's trying to balance solidifying his power as the leader of Germany with being, this leader of Europe that everyone is expecting him to be.
He's never going to be the leader of Europe. I mean, he's barely
okay, but
be the
so
leader of
then that makes
he's
it
the mayor
even
of Hamburg. That's it.
It makes it even
he's
more.
Topped out. It
makes it even more important that he's the leader of Germany.
Yeah,
and so Germany,
you're right. He has a very tough coalition, though.
And don't forget, the whole image of German tanks in Europe. I don't buy that.
And
what that evokes this argument is not something to be taken lightly. So if you're doing it in concert with Europe, it's against the U.S. It could be seen as the U.S. against and Europe against Germany, but Germany knew that other European countries would do it if he did it, and he knew he could only do it if the U.S. did it. So. Everyone's who's playing who right now. I mean,
But the Poles are ready to send. The Poles are ready to send
them anyway. Yeah,
they were ready to send them.
One thing I think is really interesting about all this. I talked to a lot of Ukrainians. I've been talking to a lot of parliamentarians from Ukraine in the last week or so, and many of them make this argument. And Andrei Yermak, the chief of staff to the president, makes this argument that if that the West is always one step behind, actually, in this battle, because they're scared, and they're scared of a bigger fight. And if they'd sent the HIMARS or the tanks last year, this war would have been over. Ukraine would have won. Russia would have pulled out. And then I've heard something really interesting, just to switch it a little, that actually this like drawing it out and having these big public fights about the tanks is actually a strategy. It's a get Putin used to the idea and then make it look like a big fight, and then it be like, oh, well, okay, finally they do give the tanks. But by drawing it out, making it so public, I don't give Scholz that credit, but that's what some people are saying. Like, this is what some of the people in the UK are saying. This is actually part of the whole overall strategy. Is this sort of?
I don't see it that way, but I think. Okay. But
maybe people try to spin it in retrospect in that way.
It points to something that I think we miss when we, and this is daily journalism versus standing back and looking at it. The drama of this particular case misses as usual, the big thing. And the big thing is that everybody, including Olaf Scholz and Emmanuel Macron, now realize that you cannot get to an end of this war by finding a way for Putin to have an off-ramp, because Putin doesn't want an off-ramp. And that the only way you're going to get to that is a military, at least to provide Ukraine with the military capacity, not only to defend itself, but to start retaking territory in order to squeeze Putin back, hopefully at some point either out, which would be the best, or to the bargaining table in which you can get a bargain that the Ukrainians.
So then it is a proxy war.
No. This is helping the Ukrainians regaining their territory, which is to say, the big debate 3 months ago was, shall we push the Ukrainians to start negotiating versus shall we arm and help the Ukrainians? That debate's over. Yeah. The debate, the idea of we shouldn't humiliate Putin. We need to find ways, and importantly, Scholz's public and I think private ruminations about why he was worried was not about negotiations. It was about Germany being singled out by the Russians if the Americans didn't have their back, which is basically the American nuclear guarantee having their back. That's what he was talking about in terms of deterrence purposes. I don't think it was particularly elegant. I don't think he's particularly good at doing that kind of stuff. I'm not even sure he needs to, but that's how he argued. But the point is, they're no longer thinking that this war ends by pushing the Ukrainians to negotiate. The only way this war ends is for the Ukrainians to decide when the time has come. And that's been Washington's position from day one. And I think that's a big, big change that now exists between the U.S. and the Europeans.
I agree with you on that, Ivo. If you don't mind, I want to get one back with the final point back on the Germans, because again, I think the step back points are important. And I think, again, you remember from your time in Brussels, I remember from my time in Brussels, one of the most striking features of European foreign policy is you have one basically hegemon, and it's Germany. And they're always so conflicted about whether to lead or not lead, particularly in foreign policy. You have Sarkozy, you have Macron, one French president after the other who wants to lead Europe, except they're a second-rate power and no one listens to them. And it's only the Germans who can lead Europe. And yet, even when Merkel was there is always this internal, we have this awkward history and we don't want to do it. And I just think you've heard, remember Radek Sikorski, who at the time was the Polish defense minister, saying, I am Polish and I'd rather an active Germany than an inactive Germany. And I think the rest of Europe is waiting for Germany to stand up and be a leader. And the Americans would love that. And Scholz is so much a ratchet down from Merkel on that regard. And I think it's a little bit, I don't want to say it's dangerous, but I think the fact that there is a vacuum in Berlin is not helpful to this.
I hear it every day in Brussels, and they say it is dangerous, that there's only one thing worse than an overactive Germany in Brussels, and it's an absent Germany. Like, Germany is acting like Estonia or Latvia when it comes to, or Denmark when it comes to being active here in Brussels, and they're crying out for more German leadership. They're like, yeah, we didn't like it that much when Merkel was always telling us what to do, but no German involvement is much, much worse for the European project.
But remember that Merkel wasn't a particularly strong leader when it came to these kinds of issues. Yes, she was on the sanctions in Ukraine in 2014, but she single-handedly stopped any military assistance, lethal military assistance to Ukraine.
But she would argue that was strong leadership.
I think
the version of it. Yeah.
But more, and I would add, I mean, she was completely wrong on how to deal with Russia, including Nord Stream 2, and all of that. And it isn't clear to me that if she had been empowered, that she would have been that strong leader on the military side of the response towards the Russians. And to give Scholz credit. He did start the pivot, the Zeitenwende, which did lead to an acknowledgement that what the policy that had been pursued up to that point had been wrong. That's a pretty strong statement. Yes, we all would like to see a more assertive, stronger Europe, but as I heard very senior chancellery officials say, we moved from kindergarten into first grade, but give us a little time to become not only teenagers but at some point adults to be that kind of leadership. Now, we would all like that to happen in months. Or even weeks or days. It's going to take years. And I think Biden's acknowledgement, and go back to his speech on the tanks, that the Germans have done a lot, that they should be encouraged to do that, is an attempt to find a way to get Germany to be stronger as a leadership, even though, Scholz's political skill set is, maybe more appropriate to be, as Jamil said, the mayor of Hamburg than the chancellor of Germany, let alone the hegemon of Europe. But he's moved, and he's moved a significant amount.
Yeah, and also, I mean, don't forget, Merkel had, a much better relationship with Putin than any of the other kind of European leaders, and it remains to be seen whether Scholz wants to. It doesn't seem right now as if he wants to follow in that footstep. So I think, we can't expect, you're talking about a global European hegemon. Not that Germany was ever acting like that, but you can't expect a big power like that to kind of turn around overnight. But I think there are some signs that, he's not necessarily as willing to give Putin the benefit of the doubt that Merkel was in a lot of cases.
I'll just say it's been 30 years since the Balkan War, and that was the moment everyone said Germany has finally arrived as a global power. They're out of area, and everyone's like, just wait for us to grow up. Just wait for us to grow up. I've been waiting for 30 years. I mean, it's always just around the corner.
I'm sorry,
no.
Peter.
No, I mean, more than fair enough. And I speak as a former Dutchman. I don't, we used to like Germany so much we were glad there were two, and sort of three if you count Austria. In one form or another. So I get the historical fear, but I also get the need for the Germans to act. But remember, wait what you wish for. And there's a huge debate in Germany on this. The Greens clearly are on a different side on this, and so was the FDP. And it's gonna take time. The reality, though, of it all is that we're at the end of our time. Really fascinating discussion, wide-ranging as usual. Some good fun, and I want to thank all of you for tuning in. I particularly want to thank Peter Spiegel, Elise Labott, and Jamil Anderlini for joining us once again for this week's edition of World Review. And we'll be back next week with another edition. Until then, have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.